Psychic readings are a curious subject. Though investigations into mediums throughout history show countless cases of fraud, people still turn to fortune tellers to make sense of their lives. Usually their questions are benign, like when somebody will buy a house, or if they look good with a mustache. But with those come the questions that show a bit more vulnerability, often concerning dead or missing relatives. So what happens when a medium takes things too far? Enter the anomaly of Sylvia Brown. Sylvia Celeste Shoemaker was born October 19, 1936 in Kansas City. Most details about her youth come from her or her organization, so they should be taken with a grain of salt. Sylvia said she was raised in a multi-denominational household and that she came from 300 years of psychics. She maintained a Catholic-oriented worldview throughout adulthood, often fitting it to suit her claims of extrasensory perception. In her book Secrets and Mysteries of the World, Sylvia said her grandmother was an accomplished psychic who educated her about aliens from an early age. Sylvia apparently had premonitions of her great-grandmother's dying as a youth. She always tried maintaining a scientific component to her supposed powers, describing them as a genetic propensity towards, quote, psychic excellence. At 7 years old, Sylvia heard a voice she later believed was a spirit guide named Francine. From one of her articles, quote, "Over the next several months, Francine would say things to me. She was very motherly towards me. She would say things like, 'You don't want to do that, do you?' Or, 'There isn't any reason to be cross.' Today I can see how smart Francine was to introduce herself to me in this way. She really helped me get to know her. Now I gladly talk to Francine all the time. There isn't a day that doesn't go by that I do not speak with Francine. I ask her for her input on so many issues." Before we continue, there's something you should take note of. These details of the first meeting with Francine have been contradicted by Sylvia in her other books, where for instance the age she says she first met her constantly changes. Sylvia would be quoted as saying she was anywhere from 3 to 18, making it difficult to consider this a mere mistake. One of her other infamous claims was visiting heaven, which she said was a comfortable 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Sylvia wrote about encountering strange phenomena throughout her youth, and her website states she often gave readings to friends and family. She didn't go public with her psychic powers until 1964, the same year she moved to California. She was gaining a reputation as a skilled fortune teller, though first-hand accounts of an early Sylvia in action are hard to find. Sylvia often repeated that she earned a master's degree in English literature around this time. But the only evidence of her in higher education is a transcript showing she didn't even finish college. Whether Sylvia was book smart or not, she knew how to find success as a psychic. But for her, popularity alone wasn't enough. Sylvia desperately sought the image of legitimacy. In 1973, Sylvia married a man named Kensel Brown, taking his name to become Sylvia Brown. To boost her credibility, she established the Nirvana Foundation for Psychic Research in 1974. Her $30 readings describe generally benign outcomes like what kind of house someone would buy. Her charisma made her popular as a fortune teller, and she wanted more. Those who remember her from the 70s describe a charming and folksy woman. Of her magnetism, a former friend had this to say, quote, "Since she knew that I was a Christian, she worked everything around cleverly to try to make me believe that what she was doing was approved by the Christian church and that God had sent her to me because he wanted the two of us to work together to spread the word throughout the world." Curiously, the same person states that Sylvia refused to accept money for her services, believing God would take away her powers if she did. This is a claim Sylvia's repeated in her books, and the following passage from that same former friend shows the loophole she used. Quote, "I also noticed that she began taking what she called donations of money. When I confronted her about this, reminding her that she'd told me that she couldn't ever charge for her work both as her and as Francine, she told me that God had suddenly told her that she could accept donations rather than charging people because, after all, how were her and Dal supposed to live?" Though this person quickly saw through Sylvia's facade, many more people still flocked to her. With the Nirvana Foundation coming around as she polished her public image, Mrs. Brown was ready to take her psychic readings to another level. In 1979, she made an early television appearance on In Search Of, where she tried contacting spirits in a haunted house.
A psychic seasoned in exorcisms, Sylvia Brown is placed in a trance in order to make contact with the spirit.
Prayers must be said in this house. Prayers must be said over the man at the end of the table. Release all negativity. And whatever is in this house that is of any negative energy, we command by the will of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit that it goes on to progression and perfection. That there is no negativity left, that there is no black whirlpool of energy.
Mrs. Brown was also frequenting the local talk show circuit as early as 1984. But despite this bump in notoriety, it wasn't enough to placate her. She wanted her psychic empire to grow faster, and was willing to break the law to do so. Yet the details of her criminal activity would remain unknown for some time, while Sylvia Brown continued to cultivate the appearance of a down-to-earth mystic who wanted to help people. Increased media attention through the 1980s gave Sylvia Brown a platform to air highly publicized predictions, most of which were unfounded. For example, she predicted Vice President George Bush would suffer from health problems in 1985, even though he went on to live another 33 robust years. In April of 1986, she formed the Society of Novus Spiritus, a Gnostic church combining Catholic tradition with elements of New Age mysticism. Though the church was gaining followers, trouble was brewing for Sylvia Brown and her husband. The couple had been selling securities in a gold mining operation they believed would pay off handsomely. Unsurprisingly, Mrs. Brown with her psychic powers foretold of great riches for anybody willing to invest. What's more is that they had sought a number of bank loans to fund their ventures, but most of these were turned down. The banks that did lend to the Browns usually got stiffed, and would have to eat the losses. The FBI opened an investigation into their finances, looking into records from 1984 onward to document evidence of fraud. The Nirvana Foundation for Psychic Research was especially scrutinized, and it was found that the group had collected over $1.2 million in ill-gotten loans. So did this money go to building her psychic institutions and eventually turning them into internationally known icons? Not exactly. Sylvia was developing especially expensive tastes and led a lavish life with the money she collected from the loans. One of her favorite tricks to use on the bank were forged tax records to make her seem worth much more than she was. With that, she could command greater credit limits and repeat the cycle elsewhere. Sometimes she reported assets worth as much as $4 million, and this was long before she was a regular on national television. The FBI believed she was taking advantage of the Nirvana Foundation's tax-exempt status, but without sufficient evidence of criminal wrongdoing on Mrs. Brown's part, the case went cold. Sylvia's troubles were far from over, though. The ordeal put a great strain on her marriage, and the Browns broke up around 1988. They were still in a legal bind over the gold securities. They raked in over $20,000 from investors, then immediately transferred it over to the Nirvana Foundation. A month later, they declared bankruptcy in the gold venture, effectively screwing everyone over. The investigation and trial lasted into 1992, when the estranged couple pled no contest for charges including, quote, sale of security without permit. They were ordered to pay restitution and were on probation for a year, and Mrs. Brown had to serve 200 hours of community service. Later, she blamed Mr. Brown for luring her into illegal activities, claiming she was none the wiser. Many joked that she didn't see it coming, to which she usually snapped back that she wasn't psychic about herself. Now, you may have thought this was the end of Sylvia Brown and her career as a psychic, considering she was a convicted fraudster. Not this time. If anything, Mrs. Brown doubled down on her claims, surprisingly leading her into the most successful years of her career. Throughout the court case, Mrs. Brown continued making television appearances as if nothing was wrong, with her trademark dry humor intact. Now, her oldest son had begun learning the family business. Sylvia's penchant for exaggeration was sometimes in full display when she appeared.
And I have a movie coming out with Sally Kirkland's going to star as me. And then I have ABC, a show for ABC.
Well, then why are we talking to you about Downward Spiral? Everything's going up for you.
I've already added Downward Spiral.
It doesn't appear this movie ever came out. Though Sylvia Brown was usually softballed by whatever television hosts invited her, there was one man who had no intention of doing so: the amazing Randy. Mrs. Brown was featured in his one-off special, Exploring Psychic Powers Live, but this didn't go how she wanted.
The name,
Bill keeps coming through so strong from you. Do you know anyone at this point by the name of Bill?
No, I don't.
There's a heavy-set, full-face man with jowls, very, very blue eyes, that really has something to do with real estate or property that's going to help you. This is aside from the Bill, because this William is also another person. And this has to do with a two-layered property. In other words, an upstairs and a downstairs.
No,
Not at this point. Okay. Because this person is going to be very significant to you by the name of William. All right? Because a lot of times these things can be in the future. Let's go to you.
She blamed the audience for her failure, saying that because they were all German, they didn't understand her through the language barrier. Randy later revealed this was untrue, and that only one audience member actually spoke German. Something that he even revealed to Sylvia in English.
There is a 2.5-year period in which it looks like you are going to be, I don't want to say without a job, but there's a flat period in which you're not doing what you want to do. And that's going to cause you a lot of dissension. And this 2.5-year period, then you're going to get into a lot of marketing and sales work. And this marketing and sales work has to do with 3 other men that you're going to be training.
I understand you're not so good. I'm a German.
I don't care whether you're German, you still work or not work, don't you? I mean, we do that in France or in Germany or wherever, don't we?
I must so much think when you speak English, and I understand all words.
Okay, 2 years of no working that you like. Okay. That's my German.
Randy, along with other skeptics, believes she was using what's called cold reading, a skill often used by professional mentalists to extract information from strangers by asking basic questions. To the uninitiated, it can seem though the user is capable of mind reading. Putting her years of work together, Mrs. Brown started writing a string of best-selling books through the 1990s. Her biggest break came in 1991, when she began appearing on the Montel Williams show, becoming its most frequent guest over the course of its run. Newspapers kept publishing Mrs. Brown's yearly predictions around December, which were invariably vague or straight up wrong. Some of her claims for the year 1999 include Monica Lewinsky being forgotten, breast cancer being fully curable, and the death of the Pope with his successor being the last. None of this happened. Mrs. Brown's live shows nevertheless drew major crowds, and she even had her own cruise trip at one point. She continued appearing on Montel and other shows, with guests being given the chance to have their questions answered by the psychic. Release forms from Montel were obtained, which in part read, quote, "I further recognize and understand that I may be surprised, embarrassed, and or otherwise emotionally upset or distressed by information revealed to me, including, without limitation, regarding missing and or deceased family members or loved one, before a live audience and its broadcast before a national television audience." As readings became more intimate, it was clear these forms were to protect her and the producers for those times when she went too far, which became more common over the next decade. But what truly showed how audacious Sylvia was becoming was her repeated claims that she actively helped law enforcement with her powers.
Do you ever work with, police?
Oh, yeah, I have 250 cases, in fact, right on my, there's a lot of cases I've solved right on Montel's show.
Some of the highest profile cases she says she worked on included the investigation of the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center and the Ted Bundy murders. As most outlets debunking this have noted, it was much harder to verify what Mrs. Brown said about being a psychic detective before the internet went mainstream. On the few occasions she did work with the police, she is said to have billed departments around $400 for work that wound up irrelevant to the case. Though this information was difficult to come by at that time, Sylvia's habit of making these off-the-cuff claims caught up with her in the new millennium. The Committee for Skeptical Inquiry investigated 115 separate instances of Mrs. Brown making such psychic predictions. They found 25 cases where she was absolutely wrong, with the rest being inconclusive due to the cases going cold. Here are just 2 of the biggest predictions that turned out to be false. 2003. Mrs. Brown told the family of Sean Hornbeck, an 11-year-old who went missing the previous year, these details about his apparent kidnapper.
Is there any kind of a description of the person driving the car?
Yeah, the guy was dark-skinned, although he wasn't black, he was more Hispanic looking. Had real long, dark hair, and strange enough Hispanic, but he had dreadlocks. He was really tall and really almost like what you think a basketball player's build would be.
Can you tell how far from the area he was taken?
Maybe about 20 miles.
He's still within a 20-mile radius even now?
He's still within a 20-mile radius of, let's say, here's where you are, 20-mile radius, but it's really southwest of where you are.
Southwest.
So whatever is southwest, because it looks like this is, here we go again with the wooded, with the, you know, the wooded area. So southwest of you.
Is there any landmarks around?
Yeah, strange enough, there are two jagged boulders which look really misplaced because everything is trees, and then all of a sudden you've got these stupid boulders sitting there.
And he could be found near
He's near the boulders.
Is he still with us?
Do you see the bicycle anywhere?
I think see, here's what's strange. I think the bicycle is in another state in a dump.
Sean's stepfather says Mrs. Brown offered an in-depth reading if he paid a sizable fee, which she denied. Sean was found alive 4 years later, and his kidnapper looked nothing like Mrs. Brown's prediction. 2004. Mrs. Brown was asked by the mother of Amanda Berry for the details of her daughter's disappearance.
Don't think I'll ever see her again.
Yeah, in heaven, on the other side.
Amanda's mother was quite visibly distressed by the highly publicized readings, leaving her with almost no hope that her daughter would ever return. Amanda's mother died from pancreatitis in 2006, 7 years before Amanda Berry would be found alive in the captivity of Ariel Castro. The Amanda Berry incident was likely the biggest catalyst for public opinion turning against Sylvia Brown, with many seeing her as a clout-chasing opportunist who didn't care who she hurt. But Mrs. Brown was adamant that she never claimed her predictions were perfect, and refused to take responsibility. Mrs. Brown was still invited on a host of television shows, with Larry King Live and Montel being her favored platforms. She infamously appeared on a morning radio show on January 2nd, 2006, the morning after the Sago mine disaster. Initially, Mrs. Brown said she had a psychic belief that the experts who thought the miners were located safely had been correct. But as the upsetting news unfolded in real time that most of them had perished, Sylvia quickly changed course and said she never thought they would survive in the first place. Those tuning into the broadcast later on would have reason to believe her, but some observant listeners noted her backpedaling. At this point, she was charging up to $750 for a telephone reading, or correspondence by letter for a cheaper price. Mrs. Brown's most publicized errors were making her critics more hostile and more willing to speak out. Citing the emotional distress her falsehoods caused, a computer programmer named Robert S. Lancaster set up a website called StopSylviaBrown.com in 2006. Here he cataloged innumerable instances of duplicity from Sylvia Brown. But although Mr. Lancaster took great care to structure the website with sound evidence, this didn't stop the attorneys of Sylvia Brown from trying to intimidate him. Mr. Lancaster refused to back down, and his website grew in notoriety. Scrutiny of Sylvia Brown was now back to an all-time high. In Mr. Lancaster's words, quote, "I found her work with missing children to be incredibly offensive." Unsurprisingly, Mrs. Brown didn't take the criticism lightly. She was refusing interviews with the media and tried finding blackmail on her biggest opponents. Quote, "I've had a private investigator on Randy and Lancaster, and I know enough on them to hang them. But I'm not going to play that game. That's vengeance, see? Who cares? Randy is an evil little man. When I told him he was going to have a heart attack and then he did, he wouldn't give me any kudos." Mr. Lancaster wasn't rattled, questioning what a psychic would need from a private investigator. These empty threats were useless to the growing body of angry people who were fed up with her shtick. In 2007, Larry King's CNN colleague Anderson Cooper delivered an investigation that was especially scathing of Sylvia Brown. In this report, Mrs. Brown's manager also quashed any hope that she would follow through with a challenge issued by the amazing Randy in 2001.
Seeking our help. What I really want to question James Randi before we go into him is this, for now, it has been bordering on a malicious persecution of Sylvia. Why doesn't he go after the charlatans, the true charlatans that are out there bilking
what is so bad about Sylvia Brown? What's so bad about Sylvia Brown?
There's nothing intrinsically bad about Sylvia Brown that isn't bad about all of the people who pretend to the grieving people out there who need them or believe they need them, that they can speak to the dead. No, I have gone after Sylvia Brown because she's a big figure. Would you mind?
So, Linda, you're saying Sylvia would not take the test, bottom line.
No, because she has nothing to prove to James Randi. She has nothing to prove to James Randi. Her spiritual work speaks for itself.
Well, we'll let the audience
to take the test.
We'll let the audience be the judge on that. Randy, appreciate you being on the program. Linda, as well. Thank you very much, James and Randy. Linda.
Thank you.
Mrs. Brown continued publishing best-selling books annually up to 2011, when her output slowed considerably. The decades of chain smoking that gave her a characteristic raspy voice in her old age had finally caught up with her, and Sylvia suffered a heart attack in March of that year. She had already been using a wheelchair for some time before that. When Amanda Berry was found alive in May 2013, Mrs. Brown took quite a bit of flack for her horrendously wrong prediction, which left Amanda's mother depressed in the final years of her life. With social media becoming one of Mrs. Brown's primary outlets, both her fans and critics had a more accessible way to air their grievances. As so often happens with these types of charismatics, there remained a loyal fan base that was inalienable. In spite of all proof that Mrs. Brown was at best inaccurate and at worst predatory, her business was still quite bustling. Even with the Amanda Brown controversy, Montel stuck by his oldest guess, something he himself took flack for. Finally, Sylvia Brown died that November, age 77. This didn't match up with her oft-repeated prediction of dying at age 88, but as she so often reminds us, she had a hard time of reading into her own future. After Sylvia's death, many of the records about her past convictions that she fought so hard to keep quiet became public. This may explain why in hindsight it seems more obvious that Mrs. Brown was not who she claimed. Her son still continues her foundation and legacy, met with the same skepticism, although he has a much smaller profile. Robert Lancaster passed away in 2019 after suffering poor health for many years, but up to then he always maintained an interest in exposing who he saw as predatory charlatans. Mrs. Brown's name came up in the news once more in 2020 when social media personality Kim Kardashian began spreading a conspiracy theory that Mrs. Brown had predicted the global health crisis in a 2008 book. But given the thousands of vague predictions she made over the course of her career, most chalk this up to just a mere coincidence. Sylvia Brown is another example of how damaging it can be to prey on people's emotions for profit. In many ways, she's cut from the same cloth as Peter Popoff, who you can learn more about in one of our previous videos. Her defenders point to those times when her predictions seemingly came true, but this seems more like a broken clock being right twice a day situation. It's often wondered whether Sylvia truly believed in her own psychic powers, but skeptics like James Randi are of the belief that she knew exactly what she was doing. Whatever the case, Sylvia Brown is a reminder of how easily we can be duped into accepting the supernatural, in spite of all of our progress, and that we can never become too comfortable in taking public figures speaking of their own abilities at face value.